Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the in-news series. The Chinese refuse to accept the international position of respecting each other's boundaries. Here I am talking about another scuffle just few days after disengaging at the hot springs. China, or I should say the PLA, People's Liberation Army, has tried to intrude India through Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. This is the one thing that we have to understand in today's episode. The details are official in nature, so you can be well assured that it has been said by the official sources. Nothing is to be doubted over there. We will also look at the history of NEFA, that is now Arunachal Pradesh. So let's first of all look at the various topics that we are going to discuss from the perspective of GS Mains paper second. And of course, if you are a student of political science, it's going to be important. Other than that, from prelims, very important facts are going to be there. Indian-Chinese soldiers clash at Tawang, Arunachal Pradesh. Indian sources have claimed that more PLA soldiers are injured. This scuffle was in a nature of beating each other by sticks and canes. And this is very horrendous in nature because we suffered, or we can say we witnessed a similar clash in the Galwan Valley, right, of 2020. So let us begin with what has happened. These are the official sources as in the defense minister has informed or briefed the parliament. That is what I'm going to reproduce over here. The scuffle has happened at line of actual control in 𝐸𝐾𝐒 area of Tawang sector in Arunachal Pradesh. Tawang is in the northwest of Arunachal Pradesh. And it all happened when the Chinese soldiers attempted to unilaterally change the status quo. Status quo means as it was, as it has been, they unilaterally tried to change it, not bilaterally, not through diplomatic means. Indian troops resisted this attempt by China, and there was a scuffle in this face-off, okay? And the matter has been raised with the Chinese side as at the diplomatic level as well. So, at the diplomatic level, the officials are already handling this. But you see, because of the non-agreement at the LAC of the concept of LAC, I should rather say it should not be a concept anymore. It should be an agreed status quo, which is not being seen to be acknowledged from the Chinese side. What kind of clash was this on the LAC? Was there on the LAC? The soldiers on the two sides, they beat each other with sticks and canes, and this was the closest encounter since the Galwan Valley incident of 2020. And both the sides, although immediately disengaged from the area, the problem remains in the future as well. Now, where exactly did the China-India clash take place and how did it begin? It all began at about 3 a.m. on December 9 at Anela along the LAC in the Tawang Heights near a point which is called 𝐸𝐾𝐒 in eastern Tawang. Okay, and this part of the LAC is one of the agreed disputed areas between the two sides. Both the sides acknowledge the fact that this is a disputed area. Indian and Chinese troops are positioned on either side of the nalas, but some 300 Chinese troops came into the Indian side at supposedly night, what we call as night, but it is actually technically morning. But at 3 a.m. it so happened that some 300 Chinese troops entered this area. But as soon as this happened, some 70 to 80 Indian troops mobilized quickly, and that was in the dead of the night, to push them back. What happened after that some Indian soldiers are also injured. They are being treated at a Guwahati hospital. But according to official sources of India, more Chinese soldiers have been harmed. A similar transgression had taken place in June 2016. Back then, around 250 PLA soldiers had transgressed into the area, but no clashes were reported then. See, this is pre-planned. The current scuffle was pre-planned. But why is it happening every now and then? Because China right now in the internal affairs is not doing very well. It is trying to grab the media, international media's attention to areas of dispute. Earlier it was Galwan, now it is Tawang. So China refuses to sit back and take all these issues at the diplomatic level. Rather than it creates a nuisance. Moving ahead, now let's talk about how was it possible that Chinese soldiers could come here. See, this time the PLA had pre-planned the transgression for an opportune time. Why? Because right now we have to understand that first of all this is the winter time and the area is heavily forested with Chinese troops occupying the top of the wall positions at this area, and they have deep supply lines and infrastructure. So infrastructurally China is very strong over here. And due to snowfall in the area, some Indian troops do withdraw at this period of time, and because of this what happened, China took the advantage of this opportunity to show their presence and maintain their presence in this area. A heavy cloud cover also made it challenging for the Indian satellites to have a map based ground reality of the site. Okay, now let's talk about LAC. Like we have line of control LOC, it's agreed to upon by both the sides, not for LAC because it is just a concept. It is not even an agreed upon demarcation line. So LAC is basically a concept that separates Indian controlled territory from the Chinese controlled territory. India considers the line of actual control to be 3,488 kilometers long, while China says that it is just 2,000 kilometers long. It is divided into three sectors: the western sector, the central sector, and the eastern sector. The central sector comprises of Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. The western sector consists of Ladakh, and the eastern sector consists of Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim both. So the middle sector, the middle or the central sector is the least volatile, while if we talk about the eastern as well as the western sector, it is the most volatile, sees a lot of Chinese intrusions in both the areas. Alright, the eastern sector is basically the McMahon line. It coincides with the McMahon line, okay, and the disagreement is on this only, of course on the western as well, but eastern sector is along the 1914 McMahon line. There minor disputes do occur due to the position on the ground, and the division of this area is based on the high Himalayan watershed, because here rivers, the perennial rivers from the Himalayas, they dominate this region. So on the watershed basis, the division has taken place. China does not agree to this principle, and this pertains to India's international boundary as well. But for certain areas such as Longju and Asapila, see, this watershed concept is going to be there for all the areas. Specifically, if we are talking about international boundaries, water, the perennial waters of the river do change their courses, right? And because of that, disputes do occur. Now, let us talk about some letters which take us back to the history of the LAC. These letters were from Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai to Jawaharlal Nehru. Zhou Enlai said that the LAC consisted of the so-called McMahon line in the east and the line up to which each side exercised actual control in the west. Shiv Shankar Menon said in his book that the LAC was described only in general terms on maps, not to scale. Okay, so this is the problem that is emanating from the Chinese side as well as India's side to some extent. Now let's talk about how did all this happen. Since the invasion of Tibet, the buffer zone that India had between itself and China, that buffer zone diminished. When Tibet was invaded, Tibet was looking towards India for help, but the feeble response India could give that time had made us lose our buffer zone. And although not demarcated, some borders were fixed near the Tibetan border, with specifically if I talk about the NEFA region, alright. And because of that, what happens that only these posts were there. These were mandated or these were agreed to upon by certain treaties, but not officially, okay. And this was of course done on the basis of treaties and also certain usage rights which were given to both the sides since the 17th century. But India thought that we could make amends with China and signed the Panchsheel Agreement in 1954. China, after that, illegally occupied the Aksai Chin and completed the construction of the Western Highway in 1957, started showing infrastructural capabilities and intrusions in these areas. India, looking at this particular threat, established a series of small posts all along the northern and eastern borders with China, but it was not able to give the army as well as the posts. Both were not able to give a fitting reply to the Chinese and were logistically unsustainable as well, these posts. So what India did as a mistake over here, that no infrastructure was maintained in this area. When large-scale fighting started between China and India back in the 1960s, the entire administration started showing itself in a jeopardy. So the officials, the army officials, were not happy with the administration. By October 23, Tawang had to be abandoned after China declared war on India. Meanwhile, the Chinese troops were advancing onto the Wolong in the east. Most of the northern NEFA was unoccupied and it was open for Chinese occupation because our administration, the army officials, most of them started evacuating that region. Thousands of Tibetan refugees also started evacuating that region, whoever was who settled in that area, and certain others as well. So refugee crisis was also started. Then the war formally came to an end with China's unilateral ceasefire on November 21 by showing that we are the bigger party over here. And on January 17, 1963, the Chinese still occupied the Tawang region. So Tawang had been in occupation of China for a period of time. In military terms, the India-China war had lasted only a month. If we talk about occupation, it was for 3 months according to certain records. Because of the difficult terrain, wet climate and financial and human shortages, India could not build its infrastructural bases over there. So what did we want to do over here? What was the reason? First of all, these are the reasons why we could not maintain a stronger presence in that area. Apart from that, the human shortages had to be filled with the locals. That means army needed civilians. Civilians from the Mishmi, Monpa and Adis, they had to be reconciled in a manner that they could identify themselves as Indian. The problem was that the Indian official state building perforce had to contend with PRC's own efforts in nearby Tibet. Why I tell you that China actually did not want to harm the civilians back then. Reason being that it wanted to show itself as the liberator. Okay, there is much evidence that PRC's occupation of northern Nepal was a sort of public relations exercise. When Indian army officials went back to NEFA after Arunachal Pradesh was called NEFA until 1972. So when Indian officials went back there, they saw that no women were molested, nobody was beaten. In fact, the Chinese soldiers brought gift and exotic presents for them. They wanted to say that China had one key message for the people of NEFA, that it was there to liberate them from India and ask them to tell us to come back and we'll free you from India. This was what the deporting troops said. Now India became really exasperated by this happening. Why? See, if you want to annex a territory, first you have to annex the culture, the people of there. But this did not happen in India's case. Many inhabitants, they did express both disappointment of having been left behind and also the problem that Indian soldiers, back then evacuated the area without taking them along, but they still wanted Indian soldiers to be there because they heard of atrocities which were committed by the Chinese in the Tibetan region. So they did not want that kind of apology. That is why they chose to coordinate with the Indian soldiers. All right. Now let's move ahead and talk about the aftermath. After the 1962 war, the Chinese claimed that they had withdrawn to 20 km behind the LAC of November 1959. See, what happens that when the second letter of Zhou Enlai comes along, it is very interesting. In this letter, Zhou Enlai says, to put it concretely, in the eastern sector, it coincides in the main with the so-called McMahon line, and in the western and middle sector, it coincides in the main with the traditional customary break, with the traditional customary line which has consistently being pointed out by China, not with but by China. So China tried to impose its own concept on India, which India did not like. So India rejected the concept of LAC in both 1959 and 1962. Whenever any scuffle happens in this area, the Chinese always say that please be in line with the 1959 agreed to upon line. So that's not the case with India. In the backdrop of the Sum-Dorong-2 standoff, the Prime Minister of India back then was Rajiv Gandhi. He visited Beijing in 1988. Two sides agreed to negotiate the border settlement, and they said that they would maintain peace and tranquility in this area. India formally accepted the concept of the LAC when Rao paid a return visit, Narasimha Rao, to Beijing in 1993. The two sides signed an agreement to maintain peace and tranquility, and the reference to LAC was unqualified to make it clear that it was not referring to the LAC of 1959 or 1962, and it was to the LAC at that time when the agreement was signed. So this as a concept has not been liked by China. Joint working group on the border issue was settled so that the task of clarification of the alignment of LAC could take place in this visit only. Now, have India and China ever exchanged map? For the middle sector, they have done so, but for the eastern and western sector, it was never exchanged. So, the process of clarifying the LAC has effectively been stalled since 2002. So, this is the problem. What is the significance of Arunachal Pradesh? Arunachal Pradesh, known as NEFA till 1972, it is the largest state in northeast India. It shares its international boundary with Tibet on the north. Towards the west, it has shared its border with Bhutan, and towards the east with Myanmar. Okay, so that is why, first of all, it is a gateway to so many countries. That's why it's important. The state right now is like a protective shield to the northeast, and China claims Arunachal Pradesh as a part of southern Tibet. It calls it southern Tibet. Likewise, it gives names to the villages of Arunachal Pradesh accordingly. The main interest actually for China lies in Tawang, because Tawang gives a strategic entry to China in India's northeastern region. Then it can effectively get its ground in the northeastern region. There are cultural anxieties as well. See, Tawang hosts the Tawang Garden Namgyal Latse or Tawang Monastery, which was founded by Merag Lodro Gyamtso. It was in the year 1680-81 in order to pay tribute or honor the 5th Dalai Lama. So, because of this only, Dalai Lama belongs to Tibet. China annexed Tibet. Now it says because the monastery in Tawang is an honor to Dalai Lama, then it also belongs to China. There are some tribes in the upper Arunachal region. They have cultural connections to the people of Tibet, specifically Monpa tribal population. So Monpa tribal population, if it gets into cultural contact or a contact with the Tibetans, then it could create a pro-democracy wave in Tibet. This is one of the fears of China. Then there are also political significance. As Dalai Lama escaped Tibet in 1959, he stayed in the Tawang monastery. So showing that it is giving a political fear and scare to China, that if Dalai Lama could stay there, then of course this is a political challenge to them. There is also the Bhutan factor, because according to certain reports, China wants to extend its road from Dokla to Gamochin so that it can well intrude in the northeastern region of India and move closer to the Siliguri corridor, and then through Chicken's Neck it can cut off the access of India's mainland to northeastern region. Arunachal's strategic location is also such that it will help China to launch missiles on India. The position is such. And then water power also, as Sangpo flows as Siang, which is Brahmaputra in Assam. So what happens that as the upper riparian state, China has a lot of power to hold the water resources as hostage so that northeastern region cannot develop. It can happen through dams. Now, first lesson that we learned from the Indo China War of 1962 is defense preparedness is mandatory. That is why India is giving so much percentage of GDP to defense preparedness, because it wants to become a world power. Then armed forces, they have to be integral part of nation's foreign policy, and they can be so only when infrastructure is maintained over here. That is why huge infrastructure drive is being done in the LAC area, specifically in the Ladakh area. War fighting is not only about weapons, but infrastructure is important so that armed forces can mobilize sooner, weaponry can be mobilized sooner, and building strong alliances is a lot important, because right now we see that India has conducted with the USA Yuddh Abhyas, the 18th edition, in Auli, Uttarakhand, which is the central sector of the LAC. So that has irked China. Now US has trashed Chinese incursions in the Tawang area. Back then we were not helped either by UK or US. Now what is happening along the LAC right now? Just 3 months ago in September, Indian and Chinese troops, they disengaged from the Gogra hot spring area of eastern Ladakh. That's over here. And the tensions are still there because China is building up troops in Depsang, intruding in Demchok, and also the rapid infrastructure at the Pangong Tso Lake. Okay. Now there is a question that I will ask you in the comment segment. You can answer that and I will take your names in the next segment. So let me see the names of those who have answered my last question correctly. Anuj, option A was the correct answer. Anuj, Hari, Faizan, Venkateshwarlu, Harsh, Pallavi, Samina, Sagarika, Krishna, Rupal, Jayaseelan, Dheeraj, MD Mustaq, Prachi, Rehan, Priyanka, Kumar, Anita. Okay, thank you all so much for answering the last question. You can answer the comment segment question and I will take your names in the next segment. Thank you.